I never thought that a Mother's Day brunch, something so simple, so sweet in theory, would end with me staring at my son as if he were a stranger. I was sitting at a round table at the country club, the sun catching on the polished silverware, making everything look so pristine and so fake. My son stood up, his arm draped around his mother-in-law, that woman with her thin smile and her perfect pearls. He held up cruise tickets like they were trophies and handed her car keys, the bow still glinting red. Cheers rose around the table. Cameras clicked. She covered her mouth like she was overwhelmed, though I could see her eyes calculating every angle of her performance. I forced myself to sit still, to breathe. Then I asked, because I had to, because after everything I had done for him, the loans, the bailouts, the nights I sat by his hospital bed, the years I carried the debt of his failed first business on my back, I thought maybe there was a small kindness waiting for me. Is there something for me? His eyes slid over to me, and for a second, I saw the boy I used to rock to sleep. But it was gone, as quick as a candle in a hurricane. At your age, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, waking up is your best gift. Laughter. The table erupted in laughter, including my daughter-in-law, who dabbed at her eyes as though wiping away tears of joy, not cruelty. I felt the room tilt, felt the heat rise up my neck. My throat burned, but no words came out. I heard forks clatter against plates, champagne glasses clink. I saw strangers' eyes dart to me, then away just as quickly, like I was a stain they didn't want to acknowledge. I sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, knuckles white. My heart beat so loud it nearly drowned out their giddy chatter. That was the moment it all changed. That was the moment I realized I was nothing but a prop in his carefully staged life, that I had become a ghost in the story I helped him write. And as I sat there, silent and humiliated, I felt something else, too. A slow, steady flame sparking deep inside me. A flame that would not be put out again. After that brunch, I went home to my small house, the one I paid off by selling my jewelry piece by piece when his debts swallowed us whole. I set my purse down, careful not to make noise, as if someone might still be watching. The afternoon sun spilled across my worn kitchen table, highlighting the cracks in the wood. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands surprisingly steady, and carried it to the living room. I opened the photo albums I kept hidden on the bottom shelf, pages full of his first steps, the birthday cakes I made from scratch when we couldn't afford store-bought ones, the graduation I worked double shifts to fund. My fingers hovered over each image like I was touching an old scar. I saw the young man who once called me his hero, the same boy who came to me sobbing the day he lost his first job, the same boy who asked me to co-sign that first disastrous business loan. I remembered pawning my wedding ring to keep his lights on. I remembered selling the pearls my husband gave me on our 20th anniversary so he wouldn't have to declare bankruptcy. I could feel my jaw tighten, my teeth grinding against the memory of every sacrifice that tasted like hope at the time. Hope that he would find his way. Hope that he would grow into the kind of man who would reach back for me. I sipped my tea, the bitterness settling on my tongue like a second betrayal. Outside, the neighborhood children played, their laughter drifting in through the open window. It sounded so distant, like a language I no longer understood. I turned the page to a photograph of us building his first office together, me holding a hammer, him beaming beside me. I had believed every promise he whispered in those early years, that I would always have a place beside him, that we were a team. But I saw the truth now, as plain as the lines on my face. I set the album down gently, my chest tight but my mind clear. He chose his mother-in-law for appearances. He chose her moneyed friends, her glittering circle. And in that small, silent room, I chose something too, to stop waiting for him to choose me back. The next morning, just as I finished sweeping the front porch, my neighbor Carol called out from across the hedge. She's the type who always carries a tote full of fresh tomatoes and town gossip. She waved a phone in the air, her face lit up with curiosity. "Did you see the photos of your son at the yacht club gala? My goodness, that new yacht is massive. And that mother-in-law of his, she looked like a queen standing on that deck." I felt the words hit me like ice water down my spine. I tried to steady my voice. "A yacht, you said?" Carol nodded, eager to fill the silence. "Oh, yes. It's all over social media. They said he made a big donation to the yacht club, and now they're considering him for the board. And that car he gave his mother-in-law, it was in all the photos too. Such generosity. I forced a smile, but my fingers dug into the porch railing until my nails hurt. I thanked her, pretending I had somewhere urgent to be, and she moved along, humming to herself. I stepped back inside and closed the door. My heart hammered in my chest, not from surprise, but from the cold confirmation. So this was it. His extravagant gifts, the cars, the tickets, the yacht. They weren't gestures of love or gratitude. They were investments. Investments in his image, in the circle he wanted to climb into. He had traded me, his own mother, for an illusion of prestige. I walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on again. But this time, I didn't feel small. I felt like a lioness cornered, quiet, but dangerous. I thought of the years I kept his business afloat, the loans I took from my retirement fund, the silent meals I ate alone, while he wined and dined his new family. I stared at the steam rising from the kettle and felt something shift in me. A resolve taking shape, solid and sharp. The photos, the yacht, the mother-in-law in pearls. They weren't the peak of his success. They were the cracks in his foundation. He thought he had traded up. But he forgot who taught him to swim in deep waters, who taught him to fight, who taught him to survive. And I would remind him in my own way. A week after Ethel's visit, I was tending to my small vegetable patch when my phone buzzed with a message from Margaret at the community center. Margaret, always one to keep her ear to the ground, never called unless something truly juicy had unfolded. Have you heard? Your son's house is in foreclosure. Rumors say, unpaid business loans. Call me. I read that line over and over. My fingers went numb, dirt crumbling from my gloves onto the soft earth. Foreclosure. Business loans unpaid. I sat down on the garden bench, the one my late husband built for me when we first moved here, back when my son was still playing in the dirt beside me, giggling about worms. I felt the first flicker of something unexpected, satisfaction, not joy, not revenge, just a deep, settling sense of poetic balance. I didn't rush to call Margaret. Instead, I leaned back and let the sun warm my face, the scent of rosemary and basil floating around me like an old friend's hug. My breathing steadied. I thought of his smirk at brunch, the mother-in-law's glittering eyes, their fake laughs echoing in my skull for days. I thought of the cruise tickets, the new car, the yacht club, all of it funded by borrowed dreams, plastered smiles, and empty credit lines. They had wanted to be admired, to be envied. They built a castle on sand, and now the tide had come in. I imagined him pacing through those grand halls, his wife screeching, the mother-in-law clutching her pearls. I imagined them rifling through papers, trying to find ways to stay afloat, every unpaid debt like a ghost tapping at their shoulders. I put down my gardening gloves, stood up slowly, and walked inside. In the kitchen, I set the kettle on the stove and picked up my knitting needles, my fingers steady as iron. When the tea was ready, I poured it carefully, savoring the small ritual. My heart no longer hammered in my chest. They had mocked my quiet, my patience, my old-fashioned ways. They thought I was a relic to be tolerated until it was convenient to discard me. But the universe has a funny way of balancing accounts. As I took that first warm sip, a sly smile tugged at the corners of my lips. I pretended not to know a thing. No calls, no pity, no desperate offers of help. Because they didn't need my sympathy. They needed to learn what it felt like to stand alone in the cold. And me? I had never felt warmer. Since this moment, I knew I had to move quick. Just a day later, I slipped out of bed before dawn. The air felt different, crisp, almost electric, as if the universe itself was urging me forward. I dressed carefully, pulling on my best coat, the one I saved for weddings and funerals. Today felt like both. I took the bus downtown, ignoring the ache in my knees. Every bump and jolt reminded me I was alive, that I still had power moving through these old bones. When I reached the lawyer's office, I stood outside for a moment, studying my reflection in the glass door. My hair was thin now, my face lined and sagging in places. But my eyes? They were fierce, unflinching. Inside, I was greeted by Harold, my lawyer of nearly 20 years. He rose quickly when he saw me, confusion flickering across his face. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, stepping forward. "I wasn't expecting you today." I nodded, setting my purse down on his polished oak desk with a thud that felt like thunder in my chest. "I need to make changes," I said, my voice steady, even. He paused, studying me carefully. "Tell me everything," he said gently, like he already sensed I had carried this too long. I laid it all out. The brunch, the yacht club, the humiliations, the unpaid loans, the mother-in-law's new car, the way my son had mortgaged his soul for shallow applause, and how I had sold my past, my jewelry, my security, my peace, to build a future he never intended to share with me. Harold listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When I finally stopped, he nodded slowly. "I want him off everything," I said firmly. "The will, the trust, the property deeds, every single paper he thinks he's waiting to inherit. I want it all gone." He raised his eyebrows, then leaned forward, his voice low and careful. "Mrs. Lawson, did you know your son quietly co-signed your property 2 years ago? It means he could attempt to leverage it for his debts if we don't act now." I felt my stomach twist, but I didn't flinch. "Then we act now," I said. Harold's eyes softened as he pulled out a thick stack of papers. "We'll start with revoking his rights to your assets and filing for immediate removal of his name from the property. These changes will be time-stamped today. It might take a week or two to reflect at the county, but from this moment on, he can't touch a cent." As I signed each page, something inside me shifted, a surge of quiet, electric power, like a current running straight into my spine. With each stroke of my pen, I wasn't just protecting my home. I was reclaiming my life. That evening, I returned home with the paperwork tucked tightly in my purse, my fingers still tingling from the final signature. I set the documents on the kitchen table and looked around my little house, my house, as if seeing it for the first time. The evening light poured in through the window, turning my old curtains gold. I sat down with a deep breath, savoring the warmth on my face, the quiet that no longer felt like loneliness, but sanctuary. I reached for the phone and dialed the number I hadn't used in years. Martin, my old friend from the bank. When his voice crackled through the line, I felt an unexpected rush of relief. "Martin," I said, steady as a stone. "I need to confirm my accounts and schedule a signature audit first thing Monday morning." He paused, then his voice softened, that old concern woven through every syllable. "Of course, Mrs. Lawson, I'll personally handle it. We'll review each account, lock everything, and require your handwritten signature for any movement. No exceptions." I thanked him and hung up. The kettle whistled, and I moved slowly to the stove, each step echoing like a drumbeat of resolve. I pulled out the lemon tart I had bought on impulse that morning after leaving Harold's office. I hadn't tasted lemon tart in years. It felt frivolous, indulgent. But tonight? Tonight, it was a small, sweet rebellion. I cut myself a generous slice, sat at the table, and ate slowly. With each bite, I felt my shoulders loosen, my jaw unclench. I thought of my son, of the empty promises and that polished smile. I imagined him discovering that his silent, soft-spoken mother had dismantled every thread of his plan, piece by piece, without raising her voice once. A strange calm washed over me, stronger than any rage. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't crying or bargaining or hoping he'd call to apologize. I felt clean. After finishing the tart, I pulled out a sheet of paper and started sketching a simple map of my next steps. Monday's audit, the property updates, the finalization of my new will, the hospital donation. I moved my pen confidently, each mark a quiet declaration of freedom. By the time I folded the paper and set it next to the tart plate, the house felt different. Not like a museum of old hurts, but like a fortress finally under its rightful guard. I rose, carried my dish to the sink, and stood for a moment, listening to the hush of the evening settling over the garden outside. It wasn't silence anymore. It was the sound of my own life, finally, beautifully, in my own hands. The next day, just as the sun crept over the hedges and poured shyly into my kitchen, the phone rang. It was my sister, Anita, the only person who could still hear the tremor in my voice, even when I swore I was fine. She didn't bother with small talk. "I heard," she said quietly, her words slipping through the receiver like a gentle hand on my shoulder. I sat down slowly. "You heard?" "About the brunch, the foreclosure, the property, all of it." Her voice cracked. "I'm coming to stay with you." I could picture her standing in her hallway, probably already half-packed, heart hammering with protective rage she'd carried for me since we were girls. For a second, I almost said yes. The idea of another heartbeat in the house, of her cooking her terrible oversalted curries in my kitchen, of her laughter echoing in the hallways, it was tempting. But I closed my eyes, drew a long breath, and let the thought pass. "No," I said firmly. There was silence on the line, heavy and expectant. "Anita, I love you," I continued, my voice low but unwavering. "But I need to do this alone. I need to be the one who faces them, who finishes this story with my own hands." I heard her exhale shakily. "You've always been the tough one," she whispered, a hint of reluctant admiration behind her sadness. I laughed softly, surprised at the sound. "No, I was the quiet one. There's a difference," she sniffed, probably dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her sari. "Call me when you need me," she said finally, her words layered with a promise only sisters understand. "I will," I lied, knowing I wouldn't. After I hung up, I stayed there at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling up from my tea. For so long I had mistaken my quiet for weakness, convinced myself that absorbing cruelty was the price of love. But in that moment I felt the clean line between loneliness and solitude. I wasn't lonely. I was standing in the clearing I had carved out for myself, one legal document, one careful plan at a time. My sister's offer had been a gentle mercy, but my refusal was my final commitment to this new self. I stood up slowly, glanced around my quiet kitchen, and felt something settle inside me. Not grief, not fear, but a still heavy power. Tomorrow, I thought, my lips curling at the edges. Tomorrow, they will see who they truly underestimated. That night, as the house hummed with a soft, almost sacred quiet, I brewed myself a second cup of tea, something I hadn't done in years. I usually rationed my comforts, saved treats for guests who never came. But tonight, I drank simply because I wanted to. I sat at the kitchen table, rolling the warmth between my palms, when my gaze drifted to the dusty recipe book on the shelf. I pulled it down, flipping past pages dotted with oil stains and old handwriting, until I found my bread recipe. The one I used to bake for my son, when he still thought my cooking was the best in the world. I tied my apron, feeling an unexpected surge of energy in my veins, and began mixing the dough. As my hands worked, my mind drifted to someone I hadn't thought of in years. Mira, the local journalist who used to run small human interest columns. She once wrote a piece about the Rose Festival and quoted me saying, "Some thorns are worth the bloom." She'd laughed when she wrote it down, saying, "You've got a way with words, Auntie." Without hesitating, I wiped my flour-covered hands and picked up the phone. Mira answered on the second ring, her voice still warm and quick, like a match sparking to life. "Mrs. Lawson," she chirped. "It's been ages. What's the occasion?" I leaned against the counter, feeling a steady, steely calm wash over me. "I have a story for you," I said simply. I heard her inhale sharply. "A story?" "Yes," I continued, my voice low and deliberate, "about a mother who sacrificed everything, her jewelry, her savings, her dignity, to help her son build his empire. And how that son chose image over blood, chose to humiliate her in public, to impress strangers." Silence fell on the line. Then I heard her chair creak as she leaned forward. "Are you ready for this to be public?" she asked carefully. I looked down at my dough-covered fingers, my old hands that had carried decades of sacrifices and secrets. "Yes," I said, my voice clear as glass. "I'm ready." We talked for over an hour. I gave her dates, receipts, fragments of conversations that had haunted me for years. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth to breathe. When I hung up, I turned back to my dough and began kneading again. Each fold and press felt like a heartbeat. 2 days later, there was a big charity event that evening. I knew he would be there, and I was ready. When I arrived at the charity gala unannounced, I knew he would be there. He loved events where he could play the benevolent son, the successful man with a heart of gold. When I stepped into the ballroom, the lights shimmered off crystal chandeliers, and soft music curled around the guests like expensive perfume. He stood near the stage, a champagne glass in one hand, his other arm draped proudly around his mother-in-law's shoulders. They posed for photos, laughed, and shook hands with the city's wealthiest donors. I didn't announce myself. I didn't need to. The moment his eyes found me across the room, the color drained from his face. A reporter, seeing my arrival, quickly approached. "Mrs. Lawson, can we get a comment on your presence tonight? We didn't know you were coming." I turned to face the camera, my heart steady, my voice calm. "I'm here to remind my son that not all gifts come wrapped in ribbon," I said. "Some gifts teach us about consequences." A hush spread through the ballroom like a slow wave. People turned, eyes darting between me and him. He tried to step forward, one hand out as if to stop me, or maybe to gather me back into the shadows where I had always waited, but I stood my ground. I felt the heat of all their stares, the sharp scent of spilled champagne, the brittle tension in every breath. Yet I felt no fear. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but I lifted a hand slightly, stopping him without a word. His mother-in-law's face twisted in confusion and anger, her fingers tightening on her pearls. I turned away then, the murmur of the crowd swelling behind me. I walked steadily toward the exit, each step echoing in the cavernous hall. Outside, the night air greeted me like an old friend. I took a deep breath and let the chills sink into my bones, anchoring me. I handed my valet ticket to the young man waiting, and as I waited for my car, I realized something simple and final. I hadn't gone there to embarrass him. I went to set myself free. I had barely made it to my car when I heard his footsteps pounding behind me. "Mom, wait!" he called, his voice ragged, already frayed at the edges. I didn't turn. I opened the car door and placed my purse on the passenger seat with slow, deliberate movements. "Mom, you don't understand," he said again, breathless now. "You're making a scene. You're ruining everything I've worked for." I turned then. Leaning against the open door, my arms crossed over my chest. I watched him struggle to catch his breath, his expensive suit now looking like a costume 2 sizes too big for the boy I once knew. "You did that all by yourself," I said, my voice low but steady. "I didn't ruin anything. I simply stopped protecting you." His mouth fell open. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. He looked around the lot, as if hoping someone might come rescue him, smooth it over like I always did. But there was no one. "You don't get it," he hissed, stepping closer. "These people, they believed in me because of you, because they thought you supported me. You were supposed to stand behind me." I tilted my head. "Behind you?" I echoed. "I have been behind you all your life, pushing, covering, funding, fixing, and all you did was run further away." He reached for my arm then, and I pulled it back sharply. The gesture stopped him cold. I looked at him, really looked. The man who had used my sacrifices like stepping stones, who had replaced my loyalty with his mother-in-law's polished approval. The man who had chosen image over blood. "I'm not your safety net anymore," I said, my voice suddenly so calm it startled even me. "I'm not your silent sponsor or your fallback plan. You will face every debt, every lie, every consequence you've earned." For a moment he just stood there, his hands twitching like he didn't know whether to beg or lash out. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. As I started the engine, I looked at him one last time through the glass, and then I drove away, leaving him in that cold parking lot, his empire of illusions already starting to crumble around his polished shoes. A few days later, I got a call from Mr. Pollard. his voice brimming with both urgency and satisfaction. "He tried to sell your house," he said bluntly. "Your son contacted an agent and filed paperwork to list it privately. He assumed his cosigner status still held weight." I felt my lips curve into a quiet, cold smile. "And?" "It's blocked," Pollard said, the triumph unmistakable. "We finalized the deed transfer in time. Legally, he has no claim. The agent has been informed, and any further attempts will be considered fraud." I thanked him and hung up. My fingers hovered over my teacup, the warmth seeping into my skin like a slow sunrise. Hours later, as twilight crept across my living room, I heard pounding at the door. I knew it was him before I even stood up. I opened the door calmly, as though greeting a distant neighbor rather than my own son. He stormed past me into the hallway, his face red, his words spilling out like poison. "How could you do this to me? You've ruined me. I had buyers lined up. I needed that money. They're going to take everything." I shut the door behind him and turned slowly. I felt no fear, no guilt, only an iron certainty that hummed in my bones. "You were never entitled to my house," I said evenly. "You were never entitled to my savings, my reputation, or my forgiveness." He stepped closer, his voice dropping low and sharp. "You're my mother. You're supposed to help me." I shook my head, my voice soft as a knife's edge. "I'm not here to catch you anymore. You turned me into a lifeline you planned to cut the moment I was no longer useful." His eyes flickered, rage, disbelief, something close to grief. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I stepped forward, close enough that I could see every line on his face, every desperate twitch in his eyes. "You will rebuild alone," I said, my voice steady as stone. "You will learn that love is not a transaction." He stared at me, stunned, silent, and for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. When he finally turned and staggered out the door, I closed it behind him, slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of every closed chapter slide off my shoulders. The next morning, before the sun rose high enough to warm the garden stones, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out my thick cream-colored stationery. I wrote a letter, not to him. He had already received all the silence he deserved. This letter was to his mother-in-law, the queen of appearances, the woman who smiled with pearl teeth and looked right through me like I was an unpaid servant at her grand table. I wrote in careful, looping script, each word a gentle scalpel. I detailed every loan I had paid, every business debt I had quietly erased, every mortgage payment I had made to save him from drowning, the private college tuition he never thanked me for, the down payments, the temporary business cash infusions that became permanent gifts. I enclosed copies of the receipts and bank transfers, proof undeniable. At the end, I wrote one final sentence. "You admired his generosity. Now you can understand whose blood he spent to buy it." I sealed it slowly, pressing my thumb hard against the flap, as if to imprint my final goodbye into the paper itself. Then I slipped into my cardigan, walked down to the corner mailbox, and dropped it in without hesitation. When I returned home, I felt a strange emptiness in my chest, not pain, but space, like a wound finally stitched closed. 2 days later, the calls started. First from unknown numbers, then from her directly. I didn't answer. By the 4th day, it hit the community grapevine. She had publicly distanced herself from him at a fundraising brunch. Witnesses said she stood up mid-toast, handed him back the car keys, and called him a parasite in tailored suits. The scandal spread like fire in dry grass. His social circle, once so quick to open their doors, turned on him with surgical speed. And I watered my roses in the late afternoon sun, each drop shimmering off the petals like small blessings. I could almost hear her voice screaming in some banquet hall across town, feel his world splintering. But I didn't flinch. I simply pressed my fingers into the damp earth, inhaled the sharp scent of new blooms, and whispered to the roses, "He was never yours to polish, nor mine to fix." A week after the scandal broke, I stood at the podium of the local children's hospital. The auditorium lights were too bright, but I didn't shrink from them. Not anymore. Behind me, a banner read, "In memory of Clifford Lawson, a legacy of hope, I wore my simple navy dress again. No pearls, no borrowed masks, just me. The director of the hospital shook my hand gently, his eyes shining with gratitude and curiosity. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered as he guided me to the microphone. I looked out at the small sea of staff, families, and a few reporters who had caught wind of my sudden sizable donation. "I'm sure," I said softly, and then I stepped forward. I took a slow breath and scanned the faces before me. The children in the front row fidgeted with juice boxes and crayons, their innocence as pure as the first morning light. My husband always believed that a good life was measured by what you leave behind for those who cannot pay you back. I began. My voice didn't shake. It rolled through the room, steady and clear, like a quiet wave. This donation is in his memory, but also in memory of the woman I used to be, the one who believed love meant endless sacrifice. I paused, letting the words echo. "I no longer believe that," I continued. "Love is not a ledger. True love does not bankrupt your soul. It builds, it protects, it honors." A hush settled over the room. This hospital, these children, they will carry forward what I once reserved for a son who saw me as currency, not as a mother. I felt my spine straighten as I set the check on the podium. The room erupted into cautious, then joyful applause. As I stepped back, a little girl in the front row stood and handed me a paper flower she had colored. "Thank you, lady," she whispered. I took it in both hands, feeling its fragile weight like a medal on my chest. Outside, as reporters clamored for statements, I turned my face to the sun. He would see the headlines, feel the shift in every room he walked into, taste the ashes of the empire he built on my back. A week after my donation, I sat at my kitchen table with the ladies from my book club. We had known each other for years. Women who had watched me shrink, disappear, then slowly reemerge like a stubborn crocus after a harsh winter. We drank tea from mismatched china cups, the steam curling around us like a gentle embrace. Someone brought lemon scones, another a basket of fresh strawberries. As we nibbled and sipped, Diane, the oldest among us, pulled out her phone and squinted at the tiny screen. "Oh, look at this," she said, her voice wobbling with half disbelief and half satisfaction. "Isn't that your son's house on the local news? They're auctioning it off today." The other women leaned in, their eyes wide, their hands frozen mid-gesture. I set my cup down carefully, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. I didn't rush to look. Instead, I tilted my head slightly, listening to Diane read the headlines aloud. Lavish estate seized due to unpaid business debts. Luxury cars and personal effects included in public auction. A hush fell over the room. Someone reached for my hand. I nodded once, slowly, my gaze fixed on the soft light playing across the kitchen walls. "I always knew that house wasn't built to last," I said quietly. I felt grief rise in me, but it didn't crest into tears. It rolled through me like a low tide. Inevitable, gentle, and then gone. Mixed with that grief was something else. Relief. The man who stood in that house had never truly lived in it. He had performed in it, staged his victories inside its halls, but he had never made it a home. As the conversation in the room shifted to softer subjects, garden pests, upcoming novels, arthritis woes, I sipped my tea and let my mind wander. Outside, the garden was blooming wildly, each flower stretching upward as if to meet the sky. I felt an unexpected warmth bloom in my chest, like a secret I didn't have to share. He would watch his possessions carried out in boxes. He would watch strangers walk through what he once called his kingdom. And I would sit here, surrounded by women who saw me, not as a purse or a pawn, but as a whole, breathing woman. It was just past midnight when I heard the knock. A slow, hesitant tapping, like a child unsure if they're welcome. I opened the door to find him standing there, drenched in sweat and moonlight. His expensive jacket hung limp on his shoulders, his eyes rimmed red and wild. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a word, he stepped inside. I didn't stop him. He moved like a ghost through the hallway, finally collapsing onto the edge of my old sofa. His chest heaved, each breath a ragged confession. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, waiting. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, splintered. "They took everything. The house, the cars, my accounts are frozen. She left me." He looked up at me then, his face crumpled into something half boy, half stranger. "Mom, I didn't think it would end like this." I didn't move. I didn't rush to hold him. Didn't offer him tea or a blanket. I watched him fall apart in my living room, the same space where he used to sprawl on the floor as a child, building forts and dreaming of nights. When I finally spoke, my voice was almost gentle, almost. "Sometimes, tough love is the last love a mother can give." His head jerked up, confusion cutting through the haze in his eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, stepping closer, my words as deliberate as a surgeon's cut, "that I won't rescue you. You must rebuild alone." I saw something break behind his eyes then, a final fracture, sharp and irrevocable. He bent forward, his hands clutching at his hair, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I let the moment stretch, let the weight of his choices settle around us like falling ash. Finally, I moved to the door and opened it wide. The night air spilled in, cool and sharp. When he looked up, I nodded toward the darkness. "You know the way out," I said softly. Slowly, like an old man, he stood. He hesitated at the threshold as if waiting for a last threat of mercy, but I had none left to give. He stepped into the night, and I closed the door behind him, not with anger, but with a final, echoing peace. That afternoon, I sat in my garden with a small radio crackling beside me, the scent of sun-warmed roses drifting through the air. I turned the dial slowly, searching for music, but instead, I stumbled onto the local news. Breaking story. The once lavish mansion belonging to local entrepreneur Daniel Lawson is being seized today after a court ruling finalized asset liquidation to cover extensive debts. I set my gardening gloves in my lap and leaned back against the bench, the words washing over me like distant thunder. They described the moving trucks pulling up, the auctioneers tagging art pieces and wine collections, reporters filming from the gates as curious neighbors peeked through hedges. I could almost see it in my mind, the grand staircase stripped of its pretenses, the halls echoing with nothing but loss. As they continued, another headline cut through. In a shocking turn, Daniel Lawson's wife has filed for divorce this morning, citing financial ruin and irreconcilable differences. I closed my eyes, feeling the last piece of a long, painful puzzle snap into place. His kingdom had collapsed, not because I pushed it, but because he built it on illusions and borrowed pride. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals catching the afternoon light like small flames. I reached out and touched one, feeling the soft, velvet edges. A butterfly landed on a nearby bloom, its wings flickering pale blue, as if it had come to deliver a blessing. I inhaled deeply, the scent of the garden filling my lungs, grounding me in this quiet, private victory. He had lost everything: his home, his image, his alliances. And yet, sitting here among my flowers, I felt no desire to gloat. Instead, I felt something else entirely: liberation. I wasn't a caretaker anymore, not a crutch, not a silent donor, not a ghost hovering behind a grown man's stage. I was simply me. I let the radio play on, the announcer's voice fading behind the chirping birds and rustling leaves. My hands fell to my sides, palms open to the sky, as if I were finally ready to catch whatever tomorrow might bring. And as the roses bowed softly in the wind, I knew with a fierce, blooming certainty I had survived him. In the days that followed, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years, old family friends who used to shuffle past me at holiday dinners, offering polite nods and empty words. They all called, their voices sticky with concern and curiosity. "He's your son," they said, almost in unison. "Are you really going to let him struggle alone? Are you going to let him live on nothing?" I listened quietly each time, my fingers drumming lightly against the kitchen table as they pleaded, reasoned, scolded. "You should help him get back on his feet. one aunt insisted, her voice trembling, as if she were the one facing foreclosure. You're his mother, isn't that what love is? I looked out my window at the garden, where the roses were blooming taller and wilder than ever. No, I said simply. Love isn't saving someone from the lessons they refuse to learn. The line went quiet every time. Some hung up in shocked silence. Others sputtered weak protests before falling away like brittle leaves. When the call stopped, I felt a hush settle over the house. Not an empty hush, but a spacious one. A hush that felt like mine. I spent the next few days redecorating. I painted the front door a soft sage green, the same color my husband had always wanted but I had postponed, too busy patching up other people's messes. I rearranged the living room furniture, pushing his old photo frames deeper into storage, making space for the small watercolor paintings I once loved, but tucked away to avoid his mocking smirks. I bought new cushions, bright floral ones, and planted lavender by the back steps. At night, I opened every window and let the summer breeze sweep through, carrying away the stale ghosts of old arguments and unspoken fears. In those quiet, moonlit hours, I moved from room to room, feeling each wall, each corner, each heartbeat of the home that was finally, truly mine again. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in a house built to please him. I was living in a home built to heal me. And each morning as I sipped my tea and watched the garden wake, I felt my own roots sink deeper into the earth, strong, unshakable, mine.